Welcome, everyone. Today we have on the podcast Tim Rayborn. Tim is a highly prolific author with a PhD from the University of Leeds who's published in history, mythology, and many other topics, and has recently published a new book, Northern Mythology, Tales from Norse, Finnish, and Sami Traditions. Welcome to the show, Tim.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I enjoy these podcasts, and it's nice to actually be able to talk to you.
It's great having you on.
Thank you.
So to start things off and sort of break the ice a bit, what is your favorite rune?
I had to think about that one. That's interesting. My experience, and I think I told you this a couple weeks ago. It's much more with the Anglo-Saxon runes. That's just the ones that I've gravitated to over time, and I really like some of the ones that I don't know for some reason they just feel good to me. Are the cattle rune, Feach. I like that. Because it represents to me not only wealth in the material sense, but also wealth in the sense of what is one's inner wealth, what is one's personal treasure, what can one offer to people, what is it about your own life that makes you wealthy in ways other than just material wealth or money. And I like that. For me, it can symbolize multiple things. So if I see that rune in a reading or something, it implies multiple levels of things. It doesn't mean, oh, I'm going to make money. That's not what I see when I see it. It speaks to abundance and to appreciating the abundance that we have in our lives. So I've always liked that one. It's in as I've said, I think before, my primary devotion is to Freya, and since it's the F rune, I also just kind of associate it with her, even though there's no historical association in there. And she's a goddess of wealth and abundance as well. So it seems like it fits very nicely together. So that would be my I would say my favorite, in that sense. Right off the top, start at the beginning of the right at the beginning of the set. We'll just do F right at the front.
What first inspired your interest in Norse, Finnish, and Sami myth?
That's an interesting question. The book is, I'll get to that in a little bit, but I first was drawn to sort of the idea of like Northern pagan traditions many, many years ago, back years ago in the 90s, which we all know were only about 11 years ago. But sometime in the mid 90s, started becoming interested in, and like many people, I think I gravitated initially to sort of more Celtic type things. That's just often people, that's the entry point, whether it's Wicca or Druidry or those. I was initially attracted by Druid beliefs, and I thought that was a really interesting. It was like my gateway into neo-pagan belief and other things. And I went back and forth with it for several years, have great respect and admiration for like the Order of Bards, Ovids, and Druids and other things. But for whatever reason, it wasn't really quite settling with me. It just wasn't quite where I felt like this is where I need to park and stay. So I started looking at other things. I became very interested in sort of Anglo-Saxon heathenry and by association also Norse. So it kind of came about that way, particularly the intersection of where England and its history intersects with both pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon belief and also the Norse and the Vikings and Danes in England in the Danelaw and such, in that historical period where they kind of brought pagan beliefs back to England for a while during the reign of Alfred and beyond. And it became a very interesting thing where this country that had been quote unquote Christianized suddenly was faced with another version of its own spiritual heritage from a different culture. And I find that really interesting, really fascinating. So I think that was it. And that became a historical interest as much as anything else. And from there, I started delving much more deeply into Nordic mythology and the Edda and those sorts of things as well. And by extension from that, also looking at, well, what was in Finland and the Finnish myths, which are so very different in some ways. There's a little bit and we'll talk about this later. There's a little bit of overlay, but they really are their own unique culture, and the language is completely different. And it's fascinating that these two societies, these two cultures kind of abutted each other, and yet they're so tremendously different from one another. So yeah, I find that a fascinating phenomenon in and of itself.
One thing I know a lot of my listeners are interested in, and is also something that's of particular interest to um, me, as folks listening on the podcast can say, is the topic of myth, both in terms of bodies of particular myths as well as just myth as a thing in and of itself.
Right, right.
Which is a subject that you dive really heavily into here, and you've also explored in other books that talk about
Yes.
lots of other different kinds of myth.
Yeah.
Um, could you dive into a bit how you understand this whole thing that we call myth?
Again, that's a simple question. I like it's interesting. I know he's taken some heat in recent years, and rightly so, but Joseph Campbell had a really interesting quote that I always like, and I'm paraphrasing it, but his statement was, a myth is something that never happened, but which is always happening. And I love that. To me, that like really sums it up. It is not true in the sense of did Odin really do this? Did Loki really do that? Did the god Lu really slay Balor? But the what I look at as myths is I look at them as inspirations for how we can also look for guidance in our own lives. And I love that idea. I think one of the grave mistakes that so many spiritual paths do fall into is mythic literalism. This is the thing that's always, and we see obviously with the Abrahamic faiths, everything has to be literal. It happened just this way. This was an intervention in history, and that's, as you all know, that's something that then leads to a lot of intolerance. Well, this happened. No, it didn't. Yes, it happened exactly the way we said it did. Whereas if you're looking at these as a body of personal gnosis, of shared cultural heritage, of things that illuminate truths, it doesn't matter whether they really happened or not, because they're true in a different sense. They're true in that they're teaching. They're teaching us things. They're showing us guidance. They're showing us things not to do, and they're always relevant in that sense. So a story told by Homer in 2,500 years ago can still be relevant now, and it doesn't matter whether it really happened. Did the Troy story happen the way that he says it does in the Iliad? Probably not, but there's so much that can be gleaned from that for modern readers, and I think that's for me that's how I approach myth. These are stories because the real meaning of myth is story, mythos. It's not a lie. We've unfortunately changed it into meaning, we talk about it's a myth that this happened, and we say that it's a lie. It's become a synonym for lie. And I don't like that because myth is a wonderful word that I think we've robbed of a little bit of its meaning and its thing by reducing it to just falsehoods. And so when we talk about the Greek myths, we're talking about a body of stories or the Norse myths that are still deeply important to us and can have a lot of truth. But it's so interesting that if you were to speak to someone about Christian myths or Islamic myths, they'll get very, very angry because myth is something that's a lie, whereas our religion is true. And I hate that juxtaposition. There can be truths within Christian teachings and Islamic teachings and such, but they don't necessarily have to represent something that actually happened. I think that's the step too far. So when myth is taken literally, too literally, it becomes dangerous. It becomes a catalyst for extremism, for violence, and other things. But if it's just relegated to being something that's false, that robs it of a lot of its richness and power.
So, building from that, what do you think are some big themes, like some big points of truth that run throughout Nordic myth?
Sex and violence. But yeah, no, there's a lot.
Like all myths, really.
Yeah. Adultery, lust, murder, all those good things. But I mean, I think if anything, all of these types of things, they are attempts by peoples at the time to explain their world and to explain why things happen the way they do. And obviously, we don't believe that the world was literally made from the body of a giant by Odin, but that was a good explanation. And people have said that there's evidence that a lot of people at that time didn't believe this either. I mean, that these were not literal. We know that like the Greek philosophers already questioned the literalness of a lot of Greek mythology of the gods and such. And many philosophers were borderline open atheists in their times as well, all the way through the Roman times. So there's the thing about how what is it? The gods are the politicians, the people found them all true. The philosophers find them all false, and the politicians find them all useful, basically. So, and that was true. That was very true in the Roman Empire. The politics and such made very good use of that to bend people's opinions. But I think that some of the bigger themes of Nordic myth certainly are things like loyalty, hospitality, generosity. These are things we find in the Havamal and the sayings of Odin. We find that those things are hugely important throughout. The generosity, not turning away someone from the hall, even when they're done wrong. We look at Lokasenna, of course, and Loki is welcome, even though he's pissing everybody off at that point. There's still this overriding, no, we still have to be hospitable, even if he's being a jerk and insulting everyone. So I think that obviously in a culture like that, where winters are cold and deadly, you better be hospitable to people, and you should expect hospitality and also offer it equally. So yeah, to me, generosity, hospitality, and courtesy are all themes that I find that run through quite a few of these. Honor, restoring honor, courtesy, respect. Those are all deep themes that I find running through these. Other people may have other opinions about it. There's lots of different things. There's all sorts of modern studies, modern scholars have looked for deeper themes. There's whole sections of queer studies on Norse myth. There's whole studies of things that relate them to other surrounding things, such as Sami and Finnish myths and such. So, yeah, those would be, I think, some of the bigger things that I find running through them.
How would you describe the sense of honor that exists in the body of myth?
Hmm. Well, it's hmm. It has a lot to do with like, promises and oaths, doesn't it? And I would say even reciprocity and such that you owe things to other people, that there's that running theme through things. But yeah, if you give your word, keep your word. If don't break it, don't go behind other people's back and stab them in the back. There's notions of that. I'm sure that it was a very stratified class system, as in so many societies. So there were all sorts of notions about who was bound to do what to who and vice versa, and what was owed to somebody of a certain class versus others. And of course, that carried all the way through to feudal Europe and beyond. So. To me, it seems like it's probably I can't say for certain because I'm not an expert in this area, but historically, I would imagine it's very much based around the idea of lords and their retainers and servants and such, and what you owe someone. You know your place in the cosmos and who's above you and who's beneath you, all the way up to and including the gods and such. So I feel like there's a knowledge of hierarchy there. Certainly would be something that I would connect with that. I don't know that other people would agree with that, but it seems to me that's important.
So, branching off from that, what do you think are some big misconceptions that you think people have about Nordic and other Northern myths?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because I think one of the things that kind of irks me, and I'll just put it out there, is that I think we've had a huge resurgence in interest in Nordic mythology over the last 15, 20 years, thanks to things like the Vikings television show and The Last Kingdom and these sorts of things, Viking metal, all these kinds of subgenres and things. There's For me, there's always heavy influence, a heavy, what's the word I'm looking for? Insistence, reliance, that's not the word, but there's a heavy emphasis, that's the word I'm looking for, on martial, on mighty warriors brandishing swords, ready to march off to Ragnarok and I feel like that's a portion, but it's a small portion of the overall picture. And it's always kind of bugged me. It's just one of those things. What we have, yeah, even just getting into that, that's a whole separate thing. But I feel like there's a sense of everything was a battle. Everything was, the the Scandinavian countries were essentially just a giant Frank Frazetta cover with people walking around brandishing their, book cover, brandishing their swords and fighting monsters and weird shamanic people, overtone singing and such. And like none of that is true. I think if you actually spent time in the Scandinavian, what were plopped back in the year 900, say in Sweden, people would look rather shockingly boring and normal. They were farmers, they were craftsmen, they were wearing kind of drab clothes. If they were wealthy, they wore colorful clothes because they wanted to show off their wealth. It wasn't all that different from anywhere else, whether it was England or Ireland or Germany or anywhere else. But we built up this myth of kind of like, there's the word. See, we built up this lie in our heads of like this sort of martial society of Viking honor and raiding and bravely doing this. And it was certainly a part of the culture, but I think it's overemphasized. Raiding was one small part of it. The vast majority of people never did that. They weren't involved with it. It was as you know, it was an economic thing that the younger sons and others did to try to make a name for themselves. It was an important part of Nordic culture, as was the slave trade, but it wasn't the only thing. And I think that there's this big sense. I think a lot of people think Northern mythology is all battles and monsters and dragons and dying horribly at Ragnarok. And there's so much more to it. There are the women's myths. There are the stories of Loki. There's all these fascinating things that don't have to do with war and battle and weapons and such. And I feel like there's just a gross overemphasis on that, in my opinion. It actually really kind of bugs me. So get on my high horse here about that.
Well, like one of the best examples of that, I think, is with the depictions of Odin,
Yeah.
particularly as sort of this like mighty god of war, a sort of ersatz Zeus almost, but most of the stories about Odin feature him like doing sorcery or like being like deceiving people or
Yeah,
like going in disguise and stuff like that. Like the only time he actually like goes out on horseback brandishing his spear is I like when he's taking on Ymir and at Ragnarok, and that's
right.
really it. Like he's
That's
not.
it. And that may be a late myth. That may be something that's, as you probably, as I'm sure you know, is that the whole Ragnarok thing itself is there's very little evidence for it outside of Iceland, outside of the Icelandic things. There's a few little things, snippets here and there, but it doesn't seem like the Anglo-Saxons had any concept of it. The Germans might have, but it seems like it might be a much, and there's the question, is there Christian influence? Is it influenced by the topography of fire and ice? There's all
Mhm.
of these sorts of things. So yeah, but people have so weighted this so heavily. Like you say, it's always
Yeah.
Odin carrying the sword and whatever, and there's no myths about that at all. So he's
Or
transformed into Conan the Barbarian when he's really more like a wily Gandalf, to be honest. So yeah,
exactly like
yeah.
Gandalf on an extremely bad day, or
Gandalf with an
it,
attitude. You know?
and like well, and also like on the topic of like Ragnarok itself, and it's something that makes it particularly interesting for us living today in like time of
Mhm.
climate change is Neil
Mm.
Price's theory
Yeah,
around the like there was a big volcanic eruption during like the
yeah,
mid 500s that like
yeah,
was recorded in Roman sources talking about it blotted out the sun and
yeah,
crop yields like diminished all over a large chunk of the world, including like
absolutely.
that far north,
Yeah.
especially that far north.
Yeah, no, it would have really inhibited growing seasons and winters would have been, you would have had 3, 4 years of very long, almost seemingly endless winter because of the global cooling that resulted. Yeah, they think it was somewhere in Indonesia, possibly Krakatoa or one of those, and it was a massive explosion. It's recorded in Chinese sources as well, and Byzantine sources, so it was worldwide. It affected everyone. Yeah, and
Yeah,
you're right, it might be a cultural memory of that.
yeah. But these are things that don't reinforce the whole, well, Conan kind of thing.
Right, exactly. It just bugs me. There's like it's so interesting that and I blame partially the TV show Vikings for it. There's this whole kind of misconception growing up about what the culture looked like and sounded like and all of it. You know, these guys walking around with their Ragnar mohawks and tattoos on the sides of their heads. There is zilch, zip, evidence that anything ever looked like this. There is no evidence that anybody ever sang in overtone chanting like they do in Mongolia or, did any of this stuff. All of that is completely fabricated from the last 10 to 15 years because people saw it on Vikings or they saw it somewhere else. And it's become a part of like this modern Viking movement that has absolutely zip to do with historical, reality at all. As I say, I think the people probably looked kind of boring.
Yeah.
They
Well,
were people.
yeah. And then that's before even getting into all like the nationalism and everything bound up in it that
Absolutely.
just goes
Yeah.
back,
Hmm.
you know,
Yeah.
hundreds of years.
Absolutely.
And
19th century, 18th century, absolutely. Yeah. And it doesn't mean that you can't create new traditions. I don't have a problem with that, but I think people trying to link it to that, like it's some sort of continuation of something, that becomes the problem. I think with neo-pagan and anything, so we have to realize that these are new traditions that are bringing about themes from these old things. They're not unbroken traditions, and I think there's still that misconception that somehow the we are the unbroken tradition of whatever, and that happens a lot in witchcraft and other things. And I think it's a dangerous sort of slope to be on, really. So yeah, it gives you a false sense of your own history.
well, I feel like there's an element with that that's almost like a sense of having to establish extra legitimacy of something that's like, well, we can stand on the same level as like, the big kids at the religion table.
And it's true because Christianity does have an unbroken tradition. Islam does have an unbroken tradition going back thousands of years. So and Judaism, Hinduism is absolutely. So, yeah, modern pagans don't really have that. So they have to invent new things. But every religion was new at some point. This is the thing.
Exactly.
Everybody thought up something at some point, even if it was 500 years ago, 2,000 years ago. So, yeah, yeah, yeah,
Oh, what related to that, like one thing I think I especially appreciated about your book is you also examine Finnish and Sami myth. And this is
yeah.
something that I don't see people do very much of when you're looking at like pagan spaces generally, but also like just looking at the body of Nordic myth of like and I think it's also part of a tendency to treat lots of bodies of myth as if they're their own little, like, hermetically sealed box. Um,
Yeah.
how do you think these bodies of myth influenced each other?
It's a really interesting question. Again, a lot of it's lost in the mists of time, unfortunately. But we know that the Norse people had contact with these other cultures. They absolutely did. There are records of their relationships to the Sami all over the sagas. We know that, and we know that the Sami were sort of feared as sorcerers and workers of magic. There was a belief that Gunhild, the wife of Eric Bloodaxe, actually studied sorcery with the Sami animus, the Noyade, I believe they're called, and she may well have. We don't know. We absolutely know that for a fact. We know that there were Nordic outposts in Finland and that there are things there. It's fascinating because there are some, I've actually flagged a couple of places in my book about that because I was looking at this. There are some interesting correspondences that people don't really know about. Let me see if I can find, if we're looking at some of the basic myths. If we look at like Sami, there was a hero, more of an anti-hero named Lemminkainen, and he's kind of an arrogant jerk. That's one of his things. He's not really somebody that you root for. He's kind of an ass. And he goes off on all these adventures and he gets in trouble. And in one instance, he actually gets killed. And it's an interesting story because he actually resembles something like the god Balder, at least Saxo's version of Balder, not necessarily Snorri's, whereas Balder is this good shining Christ-like figure. Balder in Saxo was a little bit more of a jerk. He was more of a warrior, and he and Hod had the great rivalry, the relationship where they fought with one another. And there are some interesting things. Lemminkainen he's young, he's very good looking, he's desired by everyone while having magic and divine energy. He has a very caring mother who tries to keep him from harm, but it's interesting. Both of them, for instance, in the story from the Kalevala about him, Lemminkainen dies at the hands of a blind man, just like Hod kills Balder. In this case, it was an accident. It wasn't an accident. It was actually due to a desire for revenge from someone who came after him. They're both pierced. Mistletoe pierces Balder, and Lemminkainen is bitten by a snake. Fangs pierce him, against which he has no protection. He has a lot of magical protection, but not against this. When their mothers find out, they lament for them and they try everything they can to bring them back. So there is this interesting correspondence. Now, one of the things I find really fascinating is obviously Frigg does not revive Balder, but Lemminkainen's mother actually succeeds with the help of various gods. But what happened is that after Balder was killed, his body was torn apart and cast in various bits and pieces into the river, so she had to go and look for it. Now, I don't believe there's a direct correlation, but that's an astonishing similarity to Osiris and his body being torn apart into 14 pieces and Isis having to go find it in the Nile. And I don't think there's any direct correlation, but I think it's that bubbling up from the well of the collective unconscious. We have this sort of thing. So his mother finds all the pieces and gods sew them back together and he's brought back to life. But he learns basically no lessons and ends up being just as much of a jerk afterwards as before. But so it's possible that there are some correlations there between Balder and Lemminkainen. This has been noted by quite a few scholars over the years. I find that fascinating. One of the other the characters that I find just amazing is Skadi, the Norse goddess, the Jotun, who is as goddess, whose name, of course, is masculine, but is represented as a she. And it is interesting that we have Skadi, the female, marries Njord, the male, but Njord may have been Nerthus and Skadi may have been a male. So both of them seem to have switched sex at one point, possibly. And I can see where that would be appealing to, say, like a trans heathen who's looking for someone for something that they're actually, for symbolism of which they can go through. But there's some interesting things about her. She actually is. Some people have proposed that the story of Skadi and Njord represents kind of the Norse and the Sami people and their incompatibility. She's a hunter from the mountains. He's by the sea. The Norse lived by the sea, and it represents so much of what might have been. They try to live side by side, and they can't, so they sort of amicably agree to go their way after however many days of marriage. And it might be a cultural representation of the incompatibilities of Sami and Norse with different languages, different spiritualities. There's no direct correlations between Skadi and any Sami goddess, but there are a couple interesting that I found when I was researching. There's one named Yuksaka, and she's the daughter of a major goddess named Mataraka, the great grandmother. And Yuksaka is a goddess of children, but also of hunting. And she's said to dwell, or her spirit is to be in the lavu, which are the fireplaces of a traditional Sami home, which look like nomadic teepees. And she's associated with boys, and curiously, she has the ability to cause them to swap gender. She can change a female fetus into a male fetus if the family is wanting a son instead of a daughter. So there's that gender swap again. She's a hunter. She teaches boys. She's a winter person. She's associated with wolves. Boys learning to hunt prayed to her for inspiration and skill. So she's also related to a goddess of the reindeer. So there's interesting correlations between her and the Finnish goddess Meiliki, who is the goddess of the forest, and Skadi. They all have like the same function, though they don't necessarily have the same name. There's no etymological relationship between them, but it is fascinating that she might be a Norse version of this older Sami or even Finnish goddess, and at one point may have had some sort of male aspect to it as well. So I find things like that absolutely fascinating. We're still obviously we don't absolutely know, and there are gods of thunder in the Estonian tradition, for instance, that have very similar aspects to Thor as well. So the idea of the ancient thunder god that fights the serpent goes all the way back to Indra in India and to Marduk and Tiamat in Mesopotamia. So these are ancient ideas that didn't just arise spontaneously with the Norse, but I think represent a deep wellspring of sort of collective unconscious and myth making that sort of repeats itself over and over. Maybe it travels across geography, but I think some of it is also, as I say, with like the Osiris connection, is probably just coincidence. But yeah, those are just a couple of things that stood out for me as being really interesting. That these stories probably aren't done in isolation, and there are people like I know as Interesting Price and a couple of others have found similarities between Odin and Sleipnir and Yggdrasil and some of the Central Asian and polar things about within actual shamanistic religions of the Siberian North and notions of writing. I believe that there is a Central Asian myth about an eight-legged goat or an animal that someone rides, and there are the world tree, the axis, all of that has very strong sort of shamanic sort of things, which may indicate that over time those things traveled across the polar north and imbued themselves in other things. So it's fascinating. I mean, there's a lot of debate about this, and I know that Neil Price doesn't think there's a direct influence of, say, Siberian shamanism on Sami animism, but there are definite similarities between them, and it's to me it's entirely possible that some of that filtered its way into Norse beliefs as well. I don't see how it couldn't, being so geographically close to each other for so many centuries. There would be an exchange of some kind, but again, a lot of it's lost in the mists of time, so it makes for fun speculation. That was
It
a very
does.
long-winded answer to your question.
Yeah, it was great. And it does also really illustrate how this is stuff that was like a membrane of exchange more than it was like these people are sitting over here and these people are sitting over here and they're doing their different things in those different places.
Yeah, yeah.
I think
People,
like I mean,
no,
something
go ahead.
that really is part of like, some of those misconceptions we talked about earlier is this notion of like myth being like intrinsically connected to these specific places and people. And it really is so much more fluid than that, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, the other fascinating one is that I remember reading about is the going back to Balder, the story of Balder. There's, as we all know, it's the story where Loki tricks Hod into shooting Balder and killing him with the one thing that can kill him. There's actually an Irish Celtic story similar. I believe it's about one brother jealous of another, and he tricks him into throwing a spear into a lake that's overgrown with reeds because he thinks it's a deer, but it ends up being something else. Was it his wife or something else? It's a very similar story about this. And then, of course, the person that did it is in trouble and he's punished. But that's very similar. And when you think about the number of people that probably did immigrate from Ireland to Iceland, whether willingly or as slaves, they might have brought a version of that story, and that might have been worked into the Icelandic Balder myth. We don't absolutely know, but it is rather striking for its similarity. Again, the idea of someone accidentally killing someone else by being tricked by someone, it tells me that was at least an idea, a motif that might have been folded into the Balder myth at some point during the immigration to Iceland over those centuries. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of almost like watching in much slower and much bigger time scales the something that's sort of similar to how like different internet memes and internet culture bounce around and get played with and develop and inspire other things.
Yeah, yeah, it's the telephone thing where you pass it on down and see how much it's changed by the end it gets to the time it gets to the end of the line, the old kids game. But yeah, I think that it also shows for me that these myths have real power and that they can be absorbed and reinterpreted within specific cultures to have similar meanings with a similar story, but adapted to each specific culture and whatever's appropriate for them at any given time.
What do you think is the biggest lesson that people today should take from these and other historic bodies of myth?
I would go back to the again the it sounds negative, but the dangers of mythic literalism. These stories are incredibly rich and can be very educational, very instructive, but one needs to step back from them and realize that they are what they are, and it's important to do that. I think that there's a tremendous body, and we don't even know how old some of these things are. Some of these stories are may date back to prehistoric times because we've certainly been telling stories longer than we've been agriculturalists, and it makes you wonder just how deep some of these ideas go. So we have this whole wellspring of story and tradition and belief that can be something very powerful. I think that we are kind of, I don't want to say myth starved, but I look at what I look at when I see the world today. I see some really interesting phenomenons, and I see like the explosion of interest in things like Star Wars and Star Trek and fantasy role-playing games and video games and movies and Tolkien and all of these things and whatever else you can think of, all of these genre things, comic books, graphic novels, all of these things. And there's just been this, they've always been around, but they've really exploded since the 1980s. And I think to me, it's a culture it's showing cultures that are starved for myth. These are our modern myths. And a lot of times they do restate some of the very old things. These are our Iliad and our Edda and such. And I think that's hugely important. Things that were once relegated to the realm of nerds and geeks and losers have now become mainstream, and more people love these things. And I think it's great. And I think it's hugely important because it shows that we haven't gotten rid of our need for stories. These are, our modern Beowulf and our modern Iliad. These things are very important. The Lord of the Rings, that was really one of Tolkien's whole reasons for writing it, was to create a new kind of proto-Anglo-Saxon mythology for people, and he succeeded beyond his wildest dreams in doing that because millions of tens, hundreds of millions of people love those stories now. So yeah, I think one thing that people should take away from myths is that they're always there, they're always with us. They're hugely important and they manifest in different ways. So today's Spider-Man may be a manifestation of something that was thought of as, say, Robin Hood or Reynard in the past, or whatever. There's always a need for these archetypes. There's always a need for these types of stories to be told and retold over and over again, so that we can continue to learn from them. And some of these books and these stories have very, very profound and deep meaning. And it's one of the things I find exciting about anything like that. I love stories about ordinary people in extraordinary situations, and that's so much what myth is. It's people just trying to live their lives, but then a god barges into their life, or a dragon or something else, and it's not all that different from somebody getting superpowers and then suddenly having to become a hero. It's the same idea. What do ordinary people do when unfortunate or extraordinary situations befall them? And I think that that's what we keep repeating over and over, and that's why we see ourselves in these things, as well as admiring the stories themselves. So yeah, I take that away from it. The mythology never went away. It's always here, and it's always taking new forms and new shapes all the times. If you're a Star Wars fan, obviously it's huge. If you're into comic books, it's the same kind of thing. The superhuman, whether it's Beowulf or Achilles, has always been with us, the superhero. So yeah, these myth is always here, and it's always going to be here as long as we're telling stories.
What is it that gives you hope in the times we're facing?
I think it's actually kind of related to that. I think that more and more people are identifying with those sorts of things. As we've seen this explosion of modern mythology over the last several decades, I think people are, in their own ways, reconnecting to the importance of story, and however they want to do it, whether it's in television or movies or books or fanfic or however they want to do it. I think that people are connecting with those deep things, and that helps give us a greater sense of, who we are, I think. And it's really nice to be in that situation. We're living in kind of a golden age for that sort of thing right now, and that's actually really hopeful. It tells me that more people are excited about these things. They don't see stories as just boring old things that you study in school. And I mean, there's been an explosion of interest. I think the neo-pagan movement itself is representative of that, the sort of revival of these ancient stories or modern attempts at doing ancient things, whether that's Norse, whether it's Kemetic, whether it's Celtic. I think we've seen just an absolute explosion of this, since these first started in the 60s. And what it tells me is that more and more and more people are searching for these things. What if you look at what are the biggest blockbusters every year? It's not, the lonely road trip across Arkansas. It's an Avengers film, or it's people want the spectacle. Now some people will criticize those for lacking some important human components and being all special effects driven, bloated pieces of junk. But I think it still speaks to that same deep thing. If you look under that, if you look under the commercialism and the corporations jumping on things, people are hungry for these sorts of things, even if they are overbloated, CGI-laden pieces of junk. There's still the need for a grand story there. There's no difference to me in thrilling to a Marvel movie than thrilling to hearing about Beowulf facing Grendel. You're listening to the superhero committing great deeds, and it's telling you something about yourself. And whatever medium you choose to take that in, of course, corporations are always going to slink in and try to screw things up and do things in the name of profit. But I think that's what I would take away, is that people should understand that mythology is always happening, and it pops up in new ways all the time, whether it's through neo-pagan beliefs, whether it's through modern science fiction and fantasy. There are new myths coming all the time, and that's something to really be grateful for. I think it's absolutely astonishing.
Well, Tim, it's been great having you on,
Hmm.
and thank you
Thank
again for
you.
coming on.
Yeah, thank
Before
you.
we go, is there anything that you would like to plug?
Well, I do have my new book, Northern Mythology, which is out. This came out in August, published by Cider Mill, HarperCollins. It's available everywhere. You can get it in bookstores, or you can get it online, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, any of those things. I have a couple more projects upcoming, which will be out later, and one in November, a fantasy novel, speaking of which, in November, and another a book on strange and weird Valentine's Day traditions, which will be coming out toward the end of the year. So yeah, I'm always doing things. You can go to my website, which is just timrayborn.com, and look me up. If you Google my name, it's the first site, and you can always see what my latest books and musical activities are there. Always happy to receive emails from anybody if they have any questions. There's a contact form there, so always happy to talk. And yeah, that's it, really.
Yeah. And thank you again. And
Yeah.
this has been Ryan Smith at The Wayward Wanderer, now signing off. If you want to find out more about radical heathen practice, head on over to onblackwings.com, where you can find articles, classes, resources, and more. This podcast was created and produced by Ryan Smith. Thanks for listening.